October 2023. Detroit. A security guard makes his rounds through a structure so vast it has its own weather. Rain falls through holes in the roof 4 stories above, pooling on concrete floors that haven't seen production in 60 years. Trees grow from the loading docks, their roots cracking concrete that was poured when Teddy Roosevelt was president. Staircases lead to rooms that no longer exist. Their destinations collapsed into rubble decades ago. Graffiti covers walls that once held engineering diagrams for the finest automobiles in America. Spray paint over specifications, chaos over precision. The guard walks carefully. He knows where the floors are weak, where the collapses have created drops of 30 feet or more, where the darkness hides hazards that could kill. He has worked this site for years. He has seen what happens to people who don't pay attention, who treat the building as a playground rather than a graveyard. The Packard automotive plant stretches across 35 acres on East Grand Boulevard in a neighborhood that has lost half its houses and most of its hope. 40 buildings comprise the complex, 3.5 million square feet of floor space, enough to hold 65 football fields, enough to lose yourself in for days. At its peak, 40,000 workers passed through these gates every morning and every evening, building cars that presidents and movie stars and captains of industry considered the only vehicles worth owning. The factory was so large that new employees got lost their first week, wandering corridors that seemed to have no end. So productive that it helped win 2 world wars. So advanced that engineers from around the world came to study its methods and copy its innovations. Now it stands as the largest abandoned factory in the world, a monument to something that America used to be and somehow stopped being. A ruin so vast and so haunting that photographers and urban explorers travel from every continent to walk its crumbling corridors and wonder what happened here. They come from Tokyo and Berlin and Sao Paulo, drawn by images they've seen online, compelled by something they can't quite name, seeking answers to questions they can't quite articulate. The wind moves through broken windows, carrying the smell of rust and decay and something harder to name. Pigeon droppings coat surfaces that were once polished daily. Mold climbs walls that were once painted in company colors. Rain has stained the concrete in patterns that look like tears, like the building itself is weeping for what it once was. In some rooms, you can still see the outlines where machinery once stood, rectangles of cleaner concrete amid the general grime, ghosts of assembly lines that built ghosts of automobiles that carried ghosts of workers to jobs that no longer exist. They called Packard the supreme combination of all that is fine in motor cars. For 56 years, from 1899 to 1956, the name meant excellence. It meant craftsmanship. It meant that the person driving had arrived at a station in life where only the best would do. Packard built cars for Warren Harding and Franklin Roosevelt and every president in between. Packard built engines for PT boats and aircraft that helped defeat fascism. Packard built a reputation so sterling that when the company finally died, people wept in the streets of Detroit. The factory outlived the company by decades, serving other purposes, housing other dreams until those dreams died too. Now it simply stands, too expensive to demolish, too contaminated to redevelop, too historically significant to ignore, too dangerous to enter legally, and too compelling to stay away from. 40,000 workers once built the American dream in this building. Their grandchildren drive past the ruins on their way to service jobs that pay half what the factory paid. The cars they drive are built in Mexico or Japan or Alabama. The skills their grandparents learned have no application in an economy that values algorithms over assembly, clicks over craftsmanship, data over manufacturing. Can a building contain the history of a nation? Can concrete and steel and broken glass tell the story of what America was and what it became? Can you walk through 40 acres of ruins and understand why the richest country in the history of the world let its greatest factories crumble to dust? This is the story of the Packard Plant. The workers who built it, the visionaries who created it, the executives who abandoned it, and the city that still lives in its shadow, still struggling to answer a question that has no comfortable answer. What happens when the future you were promised never arrives? If you find value in investigations of American industrial history, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which abandoned place to explore next. Your engagement makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the ruins. Before the abandonment. Before anyone imagined that something this massive could simply be left to rot. The Packard story begins not in Detroit, but in Warren, Ohio, in the workshop of two brothers who believed they could build a better car than anyone else in America. James Ward Packard was an electrical engineer with a mechanical mind and an obsessive attention to detail. His younger brother, William Dowd Packard, shared his perfectionism. In 1893, James purchased one of the first automobiles sold in the United States, a horseless carriage built by a manufacturer in Cleveland. The car was expensive, unreliable, and poorly designed. Within weeks, James had compiled a list of improvements. He visited the manufacturer to share his suggestions. The manufacturer, confident in his own genius, dismissed the complaints. "Build your own car if you think you can do better," he allegedly said. James Packard did exactly that. In a small machine shop in Warren, Ohio, James and William began designing their own automobile. They approached the project the way engineers approach problems, systematically, methodically, refusing to accept compromises that other manufacturers considered inevitable. Every component was analyzed, every design decision was questioned. If a part could be made better, they made it better, regardless of the additional time or cost. On November 6, 1899, the first Packard automobile rolled out of that small factory in Warren, Ohio. Model A, they called it, a single-cylinder horseless carriage with a top speed of perhaps 20 miles per hour. It was not the fastest car in America. It was not the cheapest. But it was, by the standards of the day, extraordinarily well built. Every component was machined to precise tolerances that other manufacturers would not match for decades. Every assembly was tested and retested before the car left the factory. The philosophy was simple. Build the best possible product, regardless of cost, and trust that customers would pay for quality. They did. Word spread among the wealthy men who could afford automobiles in those early years. Packard, they told each other, was different. Packard was better. Packard was worth the premium price. Demand grew faster than the small Ohio factory could handle. Orders backed up. Delivery times stretched. The brothers needed capital, expertise, and space to expand. They found all three in Detroit. In 1903, a group of Detroit investors led by Henry Joy acquired the Packard Motor Car Company and moved operations to Michigan. Joy was a visionary businessman who understood that automobiles would transform America and that the companies best positioned for this transformation would reap enormous rewards. He saw in Packard a brand that represented excellence, a product that could anchor the premium end of a market that was about to explode. Detroit was already becoming the center of American automobile manufacturing. The city had advantages: access to Great Lakes shipping, proximity to iron and copper deposits, a skilled workforce drawn from the carriage and marine engine industries, and a cluster of entrepreneurs and engineers who fed on each other's innovations. Ford, Cadillac, Olds, and dozens of smaller companies crowded the streets, competing for workers and suppliers, and the attention of an American public that was falling in love with the automobile. Packard needed a factory that matched its ambitions. The company hired Albert Kahn, a young architect who was revolutionizing industrial design. Kahn was the son of German immigrants, largely self-educated, possessed of a vision for industrial architecture that no one else in America shared. He had studied European factory construction and believed that American manufacturers were building inadequate, dangerous, fire-prone facilities that limited production and endangered workers. Kahn proposed something different: reinforced concrete construction that was virtually fireproof. columns and beams that could span large open spaces without intermediate supports, allowing flexible arrangement of machinery. Enormous windows that flooded work floors with natural light, reducing the need for artificial illumination and improving working conditions. Integrated systems for moving materials and products efficiently through the production process. Ventilation systems that removed fumes and regulated temperature, everything designed for efficiency, for safety, for the long terms. The result, completed in 1903 and expanded continuously for the next 8 years, was the first modern automotive factory in the world. Building 10, as the original structure was known, pioneered techniques that would be copied by every major manufacturer for the next half-century. The reinforced concrete construction became the standard for industrial architecture. The window designs, the column spacing, the material flow systems, all were studied and replicated. Henry Ford studied Kahn's work before building his revolutionary Highland Park plant. General Motors adopted his methods wholesale, hiring Kahn to design dozens of facilities across the country. The architect who built Packard's factory went on to design more industrial buildings than any other architect in history. But the Packard Plant was his first major commission, the project that proved his ideas could work at scale. By 1911, the complex had grown to nearly its final size. The building stretched along East Grand Boulevard in a continuous wall of concrete and glass, a monument to industrial ambition visible for miles. Rail lines ran directly into the facility, bringing raw materials from mines and forests across the continent. Coal from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, iron from Minnesota, copper from Michigan, leather from Chicago, rubber from Akron, glass from Toledo. Everything needed to build an automobile, arriving by the trainload, consumed by machines and workers who transformed raw materials into rolling art. Inside, thousands of specialized machines shaped metal into components that workers assembled into automobiles that represented the pinnacle of American engineering. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Visitors described walking for 20 minutes without retracing their steps, passing through department after department, each one a small factory in itself. The main assembly building alone was nearly half a mile long, a corridor of activity that seemed to stretch to infinity. Foundries melted iron and aluminum in furnaces that glowed orange day and night. Machine shops turned raw stock into precision parts on lathes and milling machines operated by craftsmen who had trained for years. Paint booths supplied up to 30 coats of lacquer, each layer hand-rubbed to a mirror finished by workers who could identify imperfections invisible to ordinary eyes. Upholstery shops cut leather from hides selected for uniform grain and color, stitching seats that would last for decades, that would still be supple and beautiful when the owners who bought them were long dead. Woodworking shops crafted dashboards and trim from walnut and mahogany, fitted so precisely that joints were invisible, finished so smoothly that touching them was a sensory pleasure. Inspection stations tested every component, every system, every completed vehicle before it could receive the Packard name, rejecting anything that fell short of standards that other manufacturers would have considered excessive. The workers who built these cars were among the highest paid in America. Packard believed that skilled labor deserved skilled wages, that you could not produce excellent products with underpaid and resentful workers. The company offered benefits that were unusual for the era: health care for workers and their families, retirement plans that provided security in old age, recreational facilities where employees could socialize and exercise. There were baseball teams and bowling leagues and company picnics that drew thousands. Workers stayed for decades, passing skills from generation to generation, building institutional knowledge that no competitor could easily replicate. Fathers brought sons into the factory, teaching them the craft of automobile building the way medieval masters had taught apprentices. The knowledge was not just technical, it was cultural. It was a way of understanding what work meant, what quality meant, what it meant to put your name on something and send it out into the world. The cars themselves became legends. The 1916 Twin Six was the first production 12-cylinder automobile, an engineering marvel that produced more power and smoothness than anything else on the road. The engine ran so quietly that advertisements showed coins balanced on edge on the hood, undisturbed by vibration. It set speed records and won endurance contests and captured the hearts of wealthy buyers who wanted the best that money could buy. The 1920s brought the Single 8 and the Deluxe 8, automobiles that defined luxury during the Jazz Age. Movie stars bought them because they looked magnificent on screen, because the lines photographed beautifully, because arriving in a Packard announced that you had arrived in life. Business titans bought them because other business titans bought them, because the Packard in your driveway told everyone that you were a man of substance and taste. The 1930s Super 8 and 12 became symbols of success during the Depression, when owning a Packard meant that you had survived, that you had prospered while others failed, that you had achieved something worth celebrating. The cars were expensive. A top-tier Packard cost more than most American homes, but for those who could afford them, no alternative existed. Other brands were for other people. Packard was for those who had reached the summit. Hollywood embraced Packard. Studios used the cars in films because they photographed beautifully and conveyed wealth and taste without words. The lines were clean and elegant. The proportions were perfect. A Packard in the frame announced that a character had arrived, had succeeded, had earned the respect of the world. Presidents chose Packard for official vehicles, for parades and state occasions, for moments when America wanted to show its best to the world. The company built parade cars and funeral hearses and ambulances and delivery trucks, each one held to the same standard of excellence, each one carrying the Packard name with pride. "Ask the man who owns one" became the company's slogan. It was brilliant marketing because it was true. It worked because Packard owners evangelized with genuine enthusiasm, because they had discovered something worth sharing, because the experience of owning and driving a Packard was genuinely different from owning and driving anything else. They were not customers. They were believers. They were members of a community that transcended mere commerce, that was bound together by shared appreciation for excellence, that recognized each other on the road and nodded in mutual respect. But belief alone could not sustain a company through the cataclysms that were coming. The Depression would test every manufacturer, the Second World War would transform the industry, and the decisions made in the decades after victory would determine which companies survived and which ones became memories. Packard faced each challenge with confidence, born of past success. That confidence would prove to be both the company's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, Packard was among the strongest automobile manufacturers in America. The company had no debt, having financed its expansion through earnings rather than borrowing. Its factories were modern and efficient, the result of continuous investment in equipment and methods. Its workforce was skilled and loyal, comprising craftsmen who took pride in their work and felt genuine connection to the company that employed them. Its reputation was unmatched, the Packard name synonymous with quality in the minds of everyone who could afford to consider luxury automobiles. Surely a company this solid could weather any storm. Surely the Depression was temporary, a correction that would pass, leaving Packard stronger than before. The first years of the Depression seemed to confirm this optimism. While competitors failed by the dozen, Auburn, Cord, Duesenberg, Pierce Arrow, Marmon, Franklin, dozens of others that had seemed permanent, Packard adapted. The company introduced lower-priced models to attract customers who could no longer afford the top-tier vehicles, buyers whose wealth had diminished but whose taste for quality remained. The 120 and the 110 brought Packard engineering and Packard quality to price points that middle-class professionals could reach. The strategy worked, at least initially. Sales declined from the giddy heights of the late 1920s, but the company remained profitable when many rivals were bleeding cash and begging banks for extensions. The factories stayed open. The workers kept their jobs. The skills accumulated over 3 decades remained available for the recovery that everyone believed was coming. The factory adjusted to reduce demand with measures that preserved both capability and humanity. Shifts were shortened rather than workers fired. Employees were rotated to spread available hours among as many families as possible, ensuring that everyone had at least some income. The company resisted the mass layoffs that other manufacturers implemented without hesitation, believing that skilled workers were an asset worth preserving, that loyalty was a two-way street, that the men who had built Packard's reputation deserved consideration during difficult times. This paternalism cost money. Every hour of work sharing was an hour of reduced efficiency. Every retained worker was a drain on cash reserves. Competitors who cut ruthlessly could offer lower prices, could undercut Packard in the market, could gain share while Packard held steady. But the paternalism also built deeper loyalty. Workers who might have fled to other employers when conditions improved stayed. Institutional knowledge survived intact. When demand eventually recovered, Packard had the workforce needed to meet it, while competitors had to recruit and train from scratch. The war, when it came, transformed everything. In December 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor ended any pretense of American neutrality. Within weeks, automobile production ceased entirely. Every major manufacturer converted to military production. Their factories turned to building the weapons and vehicles and aircraft that would defeat the Axis powers. The Packard Plant, already known for precision engineering that exceeded military specifications, received some of the most demanding contracts of the war. The Navy needed engines for PT boats, the fast attack craft that would harass Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific. The Army Air Forces needed engines for fighter planes, power plants capable of sustained high performance at altitudes and speeds that pushed the limits of contemporary technology. The company built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license, the supercharged V-12 power plants that would propel P-51 Mustang fighters across European skies. The Merlin was a British design, but British factories could not produce enough engines to meet Allied demand. American manufacturing capacity was needed, and Packard had the precision capabilities the engine required. The Merlin demanded tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, machining precision that few American factories could achieve. Components had to fit perfectly, had to withstand stresses that would destroy lesser engines, had to perform reliably at 30,000 feet, where any failure meant death for the pilot. Packard achieved these tolerances. The company produced over 55,000 Merlin engines during the war, more than any other American manufacturer, engines that powered the fighters that won air superiority over Europe. The plant also built marine engines for PT boats, the fast attack craft that operated in the Pacific. A young naval officer who would later become president commanded one of these boats powered by Packard engines that delivered the speed needed to strike and escape. The engines needed to be powerful enough to push the wooden hulls to over 40 knots, reliable enough to operate for hours at full throttle, capable of sustained high-speed operation in salt water that corroded lesser machinery. Packard's V-12 marine engines met every requirement. The boats became legends, their exploits celebrated in newspapers and newsreels, their young commanders becoming heroes. Employment at the Packard plant surged to levels never before seen. 40,000 workers streamed through the gates for 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The factory never stopped, never slowed, never rested. Production targets that would have seemed impossible in peacetime were met and exceeded. The war demanded miracles, and the workers delivered them. Women entered the factory in large numbers for the first time, taking positions that had been reserved for men, proving themselves capable of precision work that skeptics had claimed they could not do. They operated lathes and milling machines. They assembled engines that would fly in combat. They inspected components that pilots' lives depended on. The war changed who could work and what work meant, expanding possibilities even as it demanded sacrifice. The factory itself expanded. New buildings rose on every available plot. Existing structures were modified to accommodate different production lines, walls knocked down and rebuilt, floors reinforced for heavier machinery. The government invested millions in equipment that would remain after the war ended. lathes and presses and inspection tools that represented the cutting edge of manufacturing technology. The Packard plant emerged from the conflict larger, more capable and more technologically advanced than ever before. The company had proven that it could manufacture at enormous scale while maintaining the quality standards that had always defined the brand. The future seemed bright, seemed unlimited, seemed certain. The military contracts ended. The workforce needed to convert back to civilian production. The pent-up demand for automobiles seemed limitless, with millions of Americans ready to buy cars they had postponed purchasing during years of war and depression. Packard prepared to meet this demand with new models that incorporated lessons learned during wartime production. The company had money in the bank, a skilled workforce, and a brand that still commanded respect. The future seemed bright. It was an illusion built on assumptions that were already becoming obsolete. The post-war automobile market was not the pre-war market restored. It was something new, something that favored different strengths than those Packard possessed. The market wanted volume. Americans were buying cars in numbers never before seen, creating demand that rewarded manufacturers who could produce fast and cheap. Ford and General Motors had spent the war years building thousands of aircraft and tanks, mastering mass production at scales that Packard had never attempted. They converted this expertise to automobile production and flooded the market with vehicles. Packard still built excellent cars, but excellence took time. Excellence cost money. Excellence limited volume. While competitors stamped out thousands of units daily, Packard craftsmen still hand-fitted components and applied multiple coats of hand-rubbed lacquer. The market wanted style. Harley Earl at General Motors had pioneered automotive design as fashion, introducing annual model changes that made last year's car look dated. Consumers who had once bought cars for transportation now bought them for status, for self-expression, for the thrill of owning something new. Packard's conservative designs, once seen as timeless, now appeared merely old. The market wanted price points. The Big Three offered vehicles at every level, from basic transportation to luxury flagships, capturing customers young and keeping them loyal as they aged and prospered. Packard had no entry-level vehicle, no way to attract young buyers who might grow into Packard customers. The brand was something you graduated to, but fewer people were graduating. The factory that had been an advantage became a burden. The Packard plant was designed for a different kind of manufacturing, one that prized flexibility over speed, quality over quantity. The buildings were old. The equipment was aging. Retrofitting for modern mass production would cost more than building new facilities from scratch. The company made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and proved catastrophic in retrospect. In 1952, Packard introduced lower-priced models designed to compete with Buick and Chrysler. The strategy diluted the brand. Customers who wanted luxury bought Cadillac. Customers who wanted value bought Ford or Chevrolet. Packard occupied a shrinking middle ground that satisfied no one. In 1954, Packard merged with Studebaker, another struggling independent manufacturer, in a desperate attempt to achieve the scale needed to compete. The merger was a disaster. Both companies were weak. Combining them created a larger weak company with twice the problems and half the focus. Management attention divided between South Bend and Detroit. Investment dollars spread thin. The Packard identity blurred into confusion. The factory began to empty. Production shifted to Studebaker's Indiana facilities, leaving the Detroit plant underutilized. Workers were laid off by the thousands. The skilled craftsmen who had built Packard's reputation found themselves without work, their expertise suddenly worthless in a market that valued speed over skill. The layoffs came in waves, each one larger than the last. First the newest workers, those with the least seniority, then the middle ranks, then the veterans who had spent 20 or 30 years building Packards, who had assumed they would spend 20 or 30 more, who had never imagined working anywhere else. They gathered their tools and their lunch pails and walked out through gates they had entered tens of thousands of times. Some found work at other factories, though the work was never quite the same, never required the same skill, never paid the same respect to craftsmanship. Some never found steady work again, their specialized expertise useless in a changing economy, their age and wages making them unattractive to employers who could hire younger workers for less. In 1956, the last Packard automobile rolled off the assembly line. It was not built in Detroit. It was built in South Bend, using Studebaker components with Packard styling grafted on top. The car was called a Packard, but it wasn't really. It was a costume, a pretense, a name applied to a product that betrayed everything the name once meant. Enthusiasts called them Packard bakers, a term of contempt for vehicles that represented the death of a brand rather than its continuation. The factory gates closed, the assembly lines stopped. The 40,000 workers became zero. The buildings that had produced some of the finest automobiles in history sat empty, their machinery silent, their purpose extinguished. The Packard plant waited for a future that would never arrive. The death of Packard was not the death of the Packard plant. The buildings remained massive and solid, built to last for centuries. The reinforced concrete that had made them revolutionary in 1903 still stood firm in 1956. Surely someone would find a use for 3.5 million square feet of industrial space in the heart of Detroit. Surely a building this vast, this well-constructed, this conveniently located would attract tenants and investors and new purposes. For a time, someone did. The factory fragmented into dozens of separate operations, each occupying a piece of the vast complex. Chemical storage facilities moved into former assembly areas, filling spaces that had held precision machinery with barrels and tanks. Warehouses filled with goods that had nothing to do with automobiles. Small manufacturers rented space for operations that needed cheap square footage and didn't mind the aging infrastructure or the ghosts that seemed to linger in the corridors. None of these tenants maintained the buildings. Why would they? The buildings weren't theirs. The future wasn't theirs. They were renting space in someone else's monument, extracting value from what remained, moving on when the extraction was complete. Roofs leaked and nobody repaired them. Windows broke and nobody replaced them. Heating systems failed and nobody fixed them. Each winter brought more damage, ice expanding in cracks, freezing pipes that burst and flooded floors. Each summer brought more decay, heat accelerating the deterioration of materials that had been designed for controlled environments. The complex deteriorated year by year, tenant by tenant, until the tenants stopped coming and the building stood empty. Detroit itself was deteriorating along the same trajectory, following the same curve of decline. The population that had peaked at 1.85 million in 1950 began a fall that would continue for 60 years. White flight to the suburbs accelerated after the 1967 riots, draining the tax base, leaving behind residents who could not afford to leave and a city that could not afford to serve them. The automobile industry automated and offshored, eliminating the jobs that had built the middle class and replacing them with nothing. Poverty increased, services declined, entire neighborhoods emptied, houses abandoned one by one until whole blocks stood vacant, until whole streets disappeared into weeds and decay. The Packard plant became a symbol of this decline. The buildings were too visible to ignore, stretching along a major boulevard, impossible to miss for anyone driving through the city. Every broken window, every collapsed roof, every spray-painted tag announced that something had gone terribly wrong here, that the promises of industrial prosperity had been broken, that the future was not what anyone had been told it would be. Photographers discovered the ruins in the 1990s. The images they captured spread around the world, defining Detroit in the global imagination as a city of abandonment and decay. Ruin porn, critics called it, exploitation of tragedy for aesthetic pleasure. But the images were also documentation, evidence of a catastrophe that respectable media preferred to ignore. Urban explorers followed the photographers. They climbed through broken fences and shattered windows, walking corridors that hadn't seen authorized visitors in years. They found remnants of the manufacturing past, abandoned machinery too heavy to move, engineering drawings left behind when offices closed, safety posters warning of hazards that no longer existed, because the work no longer existed. They found evidence of the present: homeless encampments in sheltered corners, drug paraphernalia in rooms that once held precision equipment, fires set for warmth that spread and consumed what decay had not yet claimed. The building became dangerous. Floors collapsed without warning. Walls crumbled. Asbestos contaminated the air. The city declared the complex a hazard but lacked the resources to demolish it. Estimates for complete removal exceeded $10 million, money that Detroit did not have for a site that generated no revenue and served no purpose except as a monument to failure. Scrappers stripped everything of value. Copper wiring disappeared, ripped from walls and conduits. Metal fixtures vanished. Anything that could be sold for scrap was sold. The stripping accelerated the deterioration, opening the building to weather, removing structural elements that held walls upright, creating new hazards in spaces that were already treacherous. Fires burned repeatedly through the complex. Some were accidental, started by squatters seeking warmth. Some were arson, set by scrappers to burn away insulation and expose copper, or by vandals who simply wanted to watch something burn. The Detroit Fire Department responded dozens of times, fighting blazes in buildings where collapse was always possible, where hidden hazards lurked behind every wall, where the risk to firefighters seemed disproportionate to the value of anything being saved. By the 2000s, the Packard Plant had become internationally famous as the largest abandoned factory in the world. Tourists visited, ignoring the danger and the illegality, drawn by the strange beauty of industrial decay. Documentary filmmakers made it the centerpiece of productions about Detroit's decline. Politicians cited it as evidence of whatever point they wished to make about trade policy, urban planning, or American competitiveness. The plant appeared in music videos and fashion shoots, its decay providing atmosphere for products utterly unrelated to its history. Models posed in evening gowns amid rubble, rappers filmed among ruins that their grandparents might have worked in. The building became a backdrop, a stage set, an aesthetic resource divorced from the human stories embedded in its walls. Those human stories faded as the people who lived them aged and died. The workers who had built Packards, who had machined engine blocks and stitched leather seats and hand-rubbed 30 coats of lacquer, passed away one by one. Their children, who had grown up in houses bought with factory wages, scattered to other cities, other careers, other lives. Their grandchildren, if they thought about the plant at all, thought of it as a ruin, not as a living workplace where real people had done real work that mattered. The decay continued. Each year brought new collapses, new fires, new losses. The bridge that had connected buildings over East Grand Boulevard fell into the street, barely missing motorists. Interior floors gave way, dropping debris stories below. The complex became less a building than a landscape, a terrain of rubble and rust shaped by gravity and weather rather than human intention. Yet the structure endured. The reinforced concrete that had made it revolutionary in 1903 still held, still supported walls and floors and roofs in areas that fire and neglect had not yet reached. The building was dying, but it was dying slowly, refusing to disappear entirely, insisting on being seen and reckoned with. In 2013, a developer from Peru named Fernando Palazuelo purchased the Packard plant for just over $400,000 at a tax auction. The price was laughably low for 3.5 million square feet of real estate, a few cents per square foot, less than a parking space in many American cities. But the price reflected the enormous costs that any redevelopment would face: demolition of unsafe structures, environmental remediation of contaminated soil, asbestos abatement throughout the complex, infrastructure repairs that would cost tens of millions before a single new dollar could be earned. Palazuelo announced ambitious plans: residential units for thousands of tenants, commercial space for businesses, a technology hub to attract startups and entrepreneurs, an arts district to draw tourists and residents, green spaces and retail, and everything needed for a self-contained urban village. He promised to restore the complex to productive use, to transform the symbol of Detroit's decline into a symbol of its rebirth. He spoke of billions of dollars in investment, of thousands of jobs, of a future that would honor the past while transcending it. The city wanted to believe. Detroit had emerged from the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history in 2014. New investment was flowing into downtown, with new restaurants and hotels and apartment buildings rising from vacant lots. Young people were moving back, drawn by low costs and urban adventure, and a narrative of revival that made Detroit seem exciting rather than tragic. A comeback story was replacing the collapse story in national media. The Packard Plant, redeveloped, could be the ultimate proof that Detroit had turned a corner, that nothing was beyond redemption, that the future was brighter than the past. But promises proved easier than progress. Palazuelo's company struggled to secure the financing needed for a project of this scale and complexity. Banks were skeptical. Investors wanted guarantees that no one could provide. Construction proceeded slowly when it proceeded at all. Visible progress measured in months rather than days. Years passed with little change visible from the street. The ruins remained ruins. The decay continued. The city grew frustrated. Neighbors who had hoped for renewal saw only continued deterioration. Politicians who had welcomed the developer began questioning his capacity and commitment. Deadlines passed. Milestones were missed. The gap between promise and performance widened. Fires kept burning. Collapses kept happening. In 2022, a portion of the complex collapsed onto East Grand Boulevard, forcing road closures and raising new concerns about public safety. Debris scattered across lanes where cars had been passing moments before. The city began pressuring Palazuelo to accelerate work or face consequences, to show results or surrender the property, to deliver something or get out of the way. Some progress eventually materialized. A portion of the complex was stabilized, unsafe sections demolished, remaining structures reinforced. A few buildings were rehabilitated for commercial use, their interiors stripped and rebuilt, their exteriors restored to something approaching their original appearance. An event space opened, hosting weddings and concerts amid the industrial relics, couples exchanging vows in rooms where workers had once assembled engines. But the vast majority of the complex remained as it had been for decades, abandoned, decaying, waiting. The bridge that had crossed East Grand Boulevard lay in pieces. Most buildings stood empty. The timeline for completion stretched further into the future with each passing year. The Packard Plant today exists in a state of suspension, neither fully abandoned nor meaningfully redeveloped, caught between what it was and what it might become. Parts of it function as venues and workshops and storage. Most of it does not function at all. The future remains uncertain, dependent on financing that may or may not materialize, on economic conditions that may or may not cooperate, on a vision that may or may not prove viable, on a city that may or may not continue its fragile recovery. Meanwhile, the building continues its slow collapse. Weather penetrates, concrete crumbles, steel rusts. Each year there is less building than there was the year before. Eventually, perhaps decades from now, there will be nothing left but foundations and memories and questions about what happened and why. What does the Packard Plant mean? Why do people come from around the world to walk through dangerous ruins and photograph decay? What are they looking for amid the rubble and the rust? Some are looking for beauty. Industrial ruins possess a terrible aesthetic power, a sublimity that combines human ambition with natural reclamation. Trees grow from factory floors, their roots cracking concrete that men labored to pour a century ago. Light streams through broken skylights, illuminating dust motes that drift like memories through empty spaces. Rust creates patterns on steel that no artist could replicate, colors that shift with the light. textures that invite touch. The contrast between what was built and what remains creates images that haunt and compel, that linger in the mind long after the visit ends. Some are looking for history. The Packard Plant is a physical document of American industrial rise and fall, a text written in concrete and steel that tells a story no book can fully capture. Walking the corridors, you feel the scale of what was attempted here, the magnitude of the labor, the intensity of the ambition. You can stand in a room where thousands of workers once operated thousands of machines and try to imagine the noise, the heat, the constant motion. You understand viscerally what industrial manufacturing meant in ways that reading about it cannot convey. The building teaches through presence in ways that words cannot. Some are looking for answers. How did this happen? How did a nation that built this, that fielded 40,000 workers in a single factory, that produced the finest automobiles in the world, end up with ruins? How did a city that once rivaled any on Earth become synonymous with decay and abandonment? The Packard Plant is a mystery wrapped in rubble, a crime scene where the victim is an entire way of life. People come seeking explanations, seeking understanding, seeking someone or something to blame. Some are looking for warnings. The Packard Plant demonstrates that nothing is permanent, that success guarantees nothing, that great enterprises can fall and great cities can hollow out and great nations can lose their way. What happened here could happen anywhere. What happened to Detroit could happen to any city that depends on industries that can move or change or die. The ruins are a message from the past to the future. Do not assume your prosperity will last. Do not assume your jobs are safe. Do not assume that someone will save you when the factories close. And some are looking for hope. Even in the ruins, life persists. Trees grow. Birds nest. Art appears on walls where production schedules once hung. The building refuses to simply disappear, refuses to be forgotten, refuses to surrender entirely to time. Perhaps this persistence means something. Perhaps it suggests that renewal is possible, that even the most devastated places can find new purposes, that the story is not over simply because one chapter ended. The answers are not simple. Global competition, technological change, management failures, labor costs, trade policy, urban disinvestment, racial conflict, political dysfunction, all contributed to the decline of American manufacturing and the cities that depended on it. No single villain caused the collapse. No single hero could have prevented it. The causes were systemic, structural, embedded in decisions made over decades by millions of people pursuing what seemed like rational interests. But the complexity of causation does not diminish the human cost. The workers who lost their jobs did not lose them to abstractions. They lost them to specific decisions made by specific people in specific boardrooms and legislatures and trading floors. They lost them because the system that had promised prosperity delivered abandonment instead. They lost them because America decided, collectively and over time, that manufacturing workers were expendable, that their communities were expendable, that the industries that had built the middle class were expendable. The Packard Plant stands as testimony to that abandonment. The building was not struck by natural disaster. It was not bombed by enemies. It was simply left behind, deemed not worth maintaining, not worth protecting, not worth the investment that preservation would require. The decay is a choice, made collectively over decades, to let something magnificent rot rather than spend the resources needed to save it. That choice reflects priorities. America found money for highways but not for factories, found money for suburbs but not for cities, found money for imports but not for industry, found money for everything except the workers and places that had built the country's wealth, who were left to make do with whatever scraps the new economy provided. Drive through Detroit today and you see what those priorities produced. Empty lots where houses stood, abandoned schools where children learned, vacant factories where workers earned the wages that built the middle class. The Packard Plant is simply the largest and most visible example of a pattern repeated thousands of times across the industrial Midwest. The workers who built Packards are mostly gone now. The last of them, hired in the early 1950s as young men, are in their 90s if they survive at all. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it felt like to walk through those gates, to take a place on the line, to build something with your hands that would carry a family across the country in comfort and style. Their children remember the stories, the pride their fathers took in the work, the camaraderie of the factory floor, the Christmas bonuses and the summer picnics, and the sense that they were part of something that mattered. They remember, too, the day the gates closed, the long search for new work, the slow decline of neighborhoods that had been stable for generations. Their grandchildren inherit the ruins. They drive past the Packard plant on their way to service jobs that pay half what the factory paid, without benefits, without security, without the dignity of making something that will outlast them. They inherit a world where manufacturing is something that happens elsewhere, where the skills of their ancestors have no market value, where the buildings that once represented the future now represent only the past. Is there hope in this story? Can the Packard plant teach us anything beyond the fact that decline is possible, that great things can fall, that nothing lasts forever? Perhaps. The building endures after all. Despite decades of neglect, despite fires and weather and scrappers and time, the structure still stands. The concrete that Albert Kahn specified in 1903 still supports walls and floors. The vision that created this place still manifests in physical form, still insists on being seen, still refuses to simply disappear. And Detroit endures. The city that lost 60% of its population still has people living in it, working in it, building businesses and raising families and imagining futures. The comeback narrative may be oversold, but it is not entirely false. Something is growing in the ruins, not just trees through factory floors, but human communities finding ways to survive in a landscape of abandonment. The Packard plant may yet be reborn. Development continues, slowly. Events are held. Businesses operate. The complete transformation that was promised may never arrive, but partial revival seems possible. The building may find new purposes that its creators never imagined, may serve future generations in ways that honor the past while accepting that the past cannot be recreated. Or the building may simply continue to decay until nothing remains. That, too, would be a kind of ending, a natural conclusion to a story that began with ambition and ended with abandonment. The concrete will eventually fail. The steel will eventually rust through. The trees will eventually win. Either way, the Packard plant will be remembered. Too many photographs exist, too many films, too many stories, for the place to simply vanish from memory. Future generations will know that this building existed, that 40,000 workers once labored here, that the finest automobiles in America once rolled off these lines. They will know that something happened here that mattered, even if they cannot fully understand what it felt like to live through it. The wind still moves through broken windows on East Grand Boulevard. It carries the smell of rust and decay and time. It carries perhaps some echo of the workers who spent their lives here, who poured their labor into machines and materials, who believed they were building something permanent. They were wrong about permanence. Nothing is permanent. But they were right about importance. What they built mattered. The automobiles mattered. The factory mattered. The community mattered. The dignified work that provided dignified wages mattered. The Packard plant stands as proof that such things existed once. It stands as warning that such things can be lost. It stands as challenge to build again, to create again, to value work and workers again, before the lesson written in these ruins is forgotten entirely. The security guard finishes his rounds as darkness falls. He has walked these corridors 1,000 times, knows every danger spot, every collapsed floor, every place where the darkness hides hazards that could kill. He has watched the building change over the years, watched sections collapse that were standing when he started, watched trees grow taller in the loading docks, watched nature reclaim what industry abandoned. He wonders sometimes what the workers who built this place would think if they could see it now. The men who poured the concrete and erected the walls and installed the machinery that made Packard Packard. The men who came to work every morning believing they were building something permanent, something that would outlast them, something their grandchildren would be proud of. Would they weep? Would they rage? Would they understand how something this massive, this solid, this important could simply be left to rot? He has no answers. The building has no answers, only questions, echoing through empty corridors, bouncing off walls that have heard a century of questions and answered none of them. 40,000 workers built the American dream in this building. The building still stands, barely. The workers are gone. And the question remains, unanswered, echoing through empty corridors and collapsed roofs and rooms where precision machinery once hummed with purpose. What did we let happen? And why did we let it happen? And what will we do now that it has happened? The Packard plant has no answer. It only has the question. And the question keeps asking itself, day after day, year after year, as the building slowly falls and the memory slowly fades, and the lesson slowly becomes just another story that nobody remembers happened here. If this story mattered to you, please consider subscribing. These investigations take time to research and produce, and your support makes them possible. Tell me in the comments, which abandoned American place should we explore next? The steel mills of Gary, Indiana, the coal mines of Centralia, the textile factories of New England, the copper kingdom of Butte, Montana. Every ruin has a story. Every story has a cost. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.